Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 incredibly strange, horrific, and tragic accidents. Though calling them accidents doesn't really tell the full story. One of them, in fact, mirrors what happened to John Jones in Nutty Putty Cave, but in an entirely different setting. So although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. On Wednesday, July 22nd, 2020, an Algerian man named Zuger and his small group of fellow travelers were more than a little nervous when they woke up that morning in Sid, Serbia. Shortly thereafter, Zuger called his friend and countryman Smail, who was in Bosnia, and asked if he wanted to accompany him and 6 other North Africans on the 580-mile journey to Milan, Italy. Upon hearing this, Smail desperately wanted to join his friend. In fact, even before this conversation, he'd been trying to get out of the Balkans for months. At the time, he was stuck in Bosnia after an unsuccessful attempt to cross into Croatia a few days before. During that time, he claimed he was beaten, robbed, and extorted by security forces and border guards in various countries, which is apparently an all too common occurrence for migrants trying to cross. Now, with that said, Smail knew the risks, and he knew the trip to Italy inside the container from Serbia wouldn't be easy, but at least to be with his friend, and his ultimate goal was to find work and send money back to his family. Unfortunately, at the same time, it was a moot point because there was absolutely no way he could get to Sid, Serbia in time to leave with Zuger. But as disappointed and frustrated as he was, he had no way of knowing that his current situation was far better than what his fellow migrants were about to experience. Later that day, Zuger and 6 other men snuck into a rail yard, climbed into a dark shipping container loaded with pallets of fertilizer, and squeezed themselves into a narrow open space between the cargo and the roof. Before closing the doors, the men's handlers assured them that the train was headed to Zagreb, Croatia, and that from there the container would be shipped directly to Milan, Italy. It's unclear if the handlers actually thought the train was headed to Zagreb and then on to Milan, or whether they stuffed the unwitting men into a container they knew was going somewhere else for the sake of their own convenience. Whatever the case, the train wasn't headed to Zagreb at all. Instead, the container and the men inside arrived at a Croatian port later that night or early the following morning. The container was then eventually hoisted off the train and loaded onto a massive ocean-going ship. Somewhere along the line, one of the men sent his family the following text, quote, "There are people that aren't nice at all. God help me," end quote. Shortly thereafter, the ship made stops in Egypt and Spain, and with no restrooms or fresh water and only minimal ventilation, the conditions inside the containers must have become absolutely unbearable within a day or two. And then to make matters worse, the ship subsequently embarked on an unexpected transatlantic journey. Over the next few days, Smail repeatedly attempted to contact his friend Zuger, but tellingly, he didn't answer or return any of his calls or texts. After more than a week of nothing, Smail came to the heartbreaking conclusion that something had gone horribly wrong. It was clear that Zuger and the others never made it to Italy, and in all likelihood, something worse had happened. The vessel eventually docked in Buenos Aires, Argentina, nearly 7,000 miles away from where the men thought they'd end up. Later, the container was offloaded and transported to a facility in Paraguay, and from there it was trucked a short distance to the agriculture company that bought the fertilizer. It arrived at their facility at the end of October, nearly 3 full months after leaving Serbia. Their bodies, or at least what was left of them, were found alongside dead phones, small piles of uneaten food, bags of clothes, and mattresses stained with blood and other dried bodily fluids. According to one witness, the remains had been reduced to skin, hair, bones, and separated limbs. Later, forensics determined that the jostling of the container over the 7,000-mile voyage mixed the parts up to such an extent that it was initially impossible to tell how many victims there were. As their situation became increasingly dire, the men almost certainly screamed at the top of their lungs and banged on the sides of the container, but sadly, their cries for help wouldn't have been audible over the roar of the train. It's not clear if the men were still alive when they reached the port city or whether they were already dead when the container was loaded onto the ship, but either way, local authorities were only able to determine the number of victims by counting the skulls found inside the container. DNA samples were then taken from the container and were cross-referenced with records from Interpol and the International Committee of the Red Cross, which maintains a database of missing migrants. But in the end, the men were identified by friends and family members who came forward after images of identification cards found in the container were circulated online. One man who helped investigators identify the dead migrants was Smail. Smail told the authorities that he spent several months with the men before their fateful trip, and in that relatively short amount of time, they became like brothers. By all accounts, 30-year-old Sam was in the prime of his life as he readied himself for work on August 22, 2019. That morning, he stepped out of his apartment in the Manhattan Promenade building to begin his commute, and when he reached the elevator, he pressed the down button and waited for it to arrive to transport him to street level. A few moments later, the door slid open and Sam stepped inside with the other commuters. Then the doors closed and the car began to descend. Within a minute or so, the doors flung open to let its passengers out. Just ahead of Sam was a young man in a backpack named Tyler who stepped out onto the glossy lobby floor and then turned suddenly. He would later say that he felt as if the ground below him had given way and he whipped around just in time to see an absolutely horrific tragedy play out right in front of his eyes. The ground had vanished from his back foot as the elevator car suddenly plummeted toward the basement. In that fraction of a second between Tyler barely making it safely to the lobby and the elevator car's unexpected descent, Sam had tried desperately to make it out. But instead, his hands clung to each side of the door frame with both his feet planted firmly on the lobby's marble floor as the top of the elevator smashed into him. In the blink of an eye, his body was folded in half and dragged into the shaft between the elevator car and the wall. One moment, Sam was just going about his commute that he had made hundreds of times before, and the next, he was gone. When first responders arrived, there was absolutely no doubt that Sam was beyond saving. To make matters worse, when the elevator car dropped to the ground suddenly, there were still 3 people stuck inside the car with the crushed and mangled remains. In the aftermath, the city's investigators got to work immediately to determine how such a thing could have happened. Elevators don't just fall out of the sky, they're riddled with redundancies to prevent exactly what happened to Sam, yet the course of events that morning was unmistakable, and the entire thing was caught on closed-circuit security cameras in the lobby. Now, the building marketed itself as upscale living in a 23-story residential tower with all the amenities. At the time, one-bedroom units were going for nearly $3,700 a month, so it was the type of place that attracted young business professionals just like Sam. It also wasn't exactly the type of place that received a whole lot of complaints, with the exception of the elevator system. In fact, one of the elevators that serviced the building had a reputation that was so bad it almost bordered on comedy among the tenants. Residents complained that the elevator was often out of service, prone to breakdowns, and known to trap passengers inside for long stretches. Other times, the doors would close on their own without warning, or would stall on a floor for half an hour or more for seemingly no reason. Some even compared the ride to something out of a horror movie, as the elevator would jump up and down unexpectedly between floors. And these weren't just gripes shared in the lobby between tenants, it was such a problem that there was a prolific paper trail. Strangely though, most of the documentation existed on the other elevator, the one that didn't cause Sam's death. In fact, the elevator Sam died in had never been formally complained about in decades of operation. An elevator expert who had testified in hundreds of elevator accident cases and researched the events that led to Sam's death would later say that for a car to drop with its doors open, you'd need a perfect storm of mechanical and electrical failures happening at the exact same time. It's something so unlikely that the odds were, quote, almost incalculable, according to the expert. Without tampering or direct human interference, it simply shouldn't happen. Yet, it did, and for the people who lived in the building, that explanation fit all too well with their lived experience. They'd grown used to the elevator's quirks, the sudden drops, the erratic stops, and the unsettling sense that it might give out at any moment. The only question was why it took a fatal accident for the problem to be taken seriously. A week after the incident, the building issued an email to residents to inform them that both elevators and all the system's mechanics would be replaced, although the correspondence didn't say when exactly that would occur. Months afterward, residents reported that the old elevators were still operational and still acting up. The city then responded with an immediate order that both elevators in the building have attendants inside at all times to prevent anything like what happened on August 22nd from happening again. In the aftermath of Sam's tragic death, his family vowed to sue the building's management company for wrongful death, and as of 2025, it appears the case is still ongoing. We don't know much about Phil Longcake's childhood except for one very important and tragic thing. He grew up in northern England and was allegedly assaulted by someone very close to him between the ages of 6 and 15. Phil kept this secret most of his life, and all things considered, he dealt with it about as well as could be expected. As a young man, he worked at a local garage and attended college. He eventually got a full-time job at a local crematorium and met a young woman named Andrea, whom he married shortly after. Phil and Andrea would go on to have a son and daughter together, and in many respects, they were the typical middle-class English family. Andrew described him as a good husband and father, and the family of 4 had lots of happy times together. Phil was always especially close to his son, and as he grew up, they were more like best friends than father and son. They often went away on long weekends together, and Phil was a doting grandfather when his son and daughter had children of their own. At least on the surface, it looked like Phil had put the unthinkable trauma behind him. But behind the scenes, the horrible memories never faded, and by early 2019, 53-year-old Phil was suffering from debilitating depression and anxiety. According to his wife Andrea, he was also having a midlife crisis. She said it was like he was constantly searching for something, but she didn't know what it was, and she didn't think he did either. And sadly, soon afterward, their once solid marriage began falling apart. That fall, Phil began having an affair with a woman named Heather, and he eventually moved out of the family home. But even still, he stayed in regular contact with his wife and children. They were all just worried sick about him, but they had no idea what was going on because he never told them about any events in his childhood or how it was affecting him so many years later. Then, one day out of the blue, he did just that. He let it all come out about what was going on. In response, understandably, his family was shocked, angered, and heartbroken, and they offered to help in any way they could. At their urging, Phil began seeing a therapist, and after decades of unbearable mental anguish, it finally looked like he was on the road to recovery. Sadly, this seemed to be short-lived because unfortunately his mental state continued to deteriorate. Phil told a coworker that he shouldn't have told his family about his secrets and that he'd been a lousy husband and father, and that he constantly worried that his wife wouldn't have enough money if something happened to him. If there was any bright side in all of this, it was that Phil's relationship with his son got even stronger. They talked about things that were typically off limits to most father and sons, and Phil even told his son that he regularly thought about ending things. He apparently even told his therapist the same thing, and in early September of 2019, he made an attempt. Thankfully, this was unsuccessful, and he recovered from the failed attempt and got himself back on track. He also assured his son that he wouldn't do it again, and shortly thereafter, he took another huge step by reporting the events of his childhood to the Cumbria police. He was initially hopeful that the perpetrator would finally be held accountable, and the authorities took the allegations seriously, but investigators unfortunately dropped the case a few months later because of a lack of evidence. Upon learning this, Phil was so devastated by the news that he made another unsuccessful attempt to end things, and afterward he became even more withdrawn than he was before. In one particularly candid moment, he told another coworker about some of the ways he envisioned ending things. In another instant, he allegedly told his girlfriend that he thought about climbing to the top of Dixon's chimney and ending it there. Dixon's chimney was one of the most iconic landmarks in Carlisle. It towers 290 feet above the ground and was constructed in the mid-1830s to pump exhaust from a mill up into the atmosphere and away from the residents. But despite telling his therapist, his son, his coworker, and his girlfriend that he regularly thought about these things, Phil apparently managed to convince everyone that he was okay and that things were actually looking up. Then, early on the afternoon of Sunday, October 27, 2019, he dropped by the home in Carlisle where he had once lived with his children and his wife. Andrea obviously wasn't expecting him, and she immediately noticed that his behavior was a little off. For one thing, he called her Moo for the first time in ages. Moo was an affectionate nickname for Andrea that he used when they were happily married years before, and by then she couldn't even remember the last time he had used it. Andrea also noticed that Phil was giving the family dog much more affection than normal. This wasn't strange in itself because Phil had always been fond of the dog, but later Andrea said that she felt like he was saying goodbye without actually saying goodbye. She also got the impression that he had something important to do later that day, but she decided not to ask him what it was. Before Phil left, he told her that she'd never have to worry about money and that she and the kids would be fine. As soon as he left the door, Andrea called their son and told him about the strange and suspiciously sentimental encounter she just had with his father. In response, he told her that he had recently spoken with him as well, and that he also got the impression that something wasn't right. After talking to her son, Andrea called her daughter to tell her what was going on. They then all agreed that they needed to find Phil as soon as possible. They then called everyone they could think of, including his friends, coworkers, and his girlfriend. His girlfriend would say that she was supposed to see Phil later that afternoon, but neither she nor anyone else had any idea where he was. Phil's family eventually got so worried that they called the police and reported him missing. His whereabouts were at the time unknown, but a security camera captured him driving his van in Carlisle at 4:15 p.m. About an hour later, witnesses saw him walking toward Dixon's chimney carrying 2 ladders. It was later learned that he needed the ladders because the chimney's built-in metal steps didn't start until about 15 feet up the base. But in any case, once he was high enough, he crossed the ladder to the steps and began making his way toward the top of the chimney, nearly 300 feet up. We'll never know what exactly was going through Phil's mind or why he was climbing the chimney in the first place, but considering his childhood and the subsequent mental anguish he'd been dealing with for more than 3 decades, it's safe to assume what his plan was. However, shortly after reaching the top, something happened that prevented him from carrying out his original plan, or at least that seems to be the case. Phil may have attempted it, or he might have slipped and fallen, or simply made a clumsy misstep. Either way, his foot and ankle became wedged between the chimney and the metal steps anchored into the masonry. Even worse, the way he had fallen caused him to be in a precarious inverted position with his legs and feet above him and his head pointed straight down. Afterward, no matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't dislodge his ankle. That night, the temperature plummeted to below freezing, and worse yet, blood began collecting in his arms and head, and his internal organs began to descend to the lowest point in his abdominal cavity. So in addition to the bitter cold, this would have been painful and made it more difficult for him to breathe with each passing minute. Between 11 p.m. that night and 2:20 a.m. the following morning, workers at a post office across the street heard eerie groans coming from the direction of the old mill. These sounds eventually got so loud and so unsettling that they called the police. The responding officers then walked across the street to the mill, and when they shone their flashlights skyward, they were surprised to see a shirtless man hanging upside down from the top of Dixon's chimney. They didn't know who it was or how he got there or how long he'd been there, but by then, Phil had been hanging upside down for nearly 9 hours. It didn't take authorities long afterward to piece everything together, but they also knew that they didn't have the training or equipment to bring him down on their own. At so high off the ground, a rescue attempt would endanger Phil and the rescuers themselves. They ultimately decided to use a massive boom truck or cherry picker with a 295-foot reach. By the time it arrived from Glasgow, Scotland, nearly 100 miles away, a large crowd had gathered. Police officers, firefighters, Coast Guard personnel, and dedicated alpine rescuers continued the epic 14-hour rescue effort. But, tragically, Phil was already dead when they reached him, and by the time they brought him down at 4:40 p.m. on Monday, October 28th, he'd been stuck on the top of Dixon's chimney for approximately 24 hours. The local coroner determined that Phil passed away at approximately 8 a.m. and that he died from hypothermia and cerebral swelling caused by being stuck in an inverted position for such an extended period of time. Nobody knows exactly what happened at the top of Dixon's chimney that fateful day, but the coroner concluded that Phil deliberately placed himself in a perilous position that led to him accidentally getting lodged the way he did. At the inquest, his family testified about his childhood and the events that occurred for nearly a decade. Sometime later, Phil's son said that he may have planned the Dixon's chimney attempt to send a dramatic and unforgettable message to the person who committed the heinous events of his childhood. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.